How old were you when you got your first job? 16 maybe? 17, minimum wage, thinking that was the beginning of something. The men we are talking about today didn't wait that long. One started at 13, in Harlem, on basketball courts that the whole city watched, where everyone saw the talent, where college scouts made offers, where the NBA sent a draft pick. He turned all of it down because the streets paid more. Another started as a teenage errand boy, running messages for the most feared black criminal organization in Philadelphia, watching everything, learning everything, then building something bigger than the men who trained him ever imagined. Another started in his early 20s in South Central Los Angeles. He built a $2 million a day operation. He was put in prison, and then from inside a prison cell, he co-founded the most influential record label in the history of hip-hop. And one more, a teenager in Harlem in the 1980s, who the New York Times would eventually describe as the biggest drug lord in Harlem since Nicky Barnes, who built his empire, lost it, went to prison, and invented an entirely new industry from his cell. 4 men, 4 cities, 4 stories your audience has never heard told the right way. Starting now. Number 1, Pee Wee Kirkland, age 13, Harlem. The man who turned down the NBA. Harlem, 1958. Richard Kirkland is 13 years old. He is already one of the most talented basketball players anyone in Harlem has ever seen. Not talented for his age, talented, period. The kind of natural ability that stops conversations on playground courts when he picks up the ball. The kind of handles and instincts that make men twice his size look slow. He starts playing at Rucker Park, the legendary outdoor court on 155th Street, where the best players in New York have been proving themselves since 1950. The court where basketball legends are made, where NBA players come in the summer to test themselves against the streets. Pee Wee Kirkland tests himself against everyone and beats almost all of them. But at 13, alongside the basketball, something else is also starting. He begins committing robberies to finance what he is already thinking of as a drug operation. Not casually, not impulsively, deliberately. He is 13 years old and already treating the streets as a business problem to be solved. He sees what the heroin trade is doing to Harlem, what money it is generating, what kind of power it creates for the men who control it. He decides he wants that power, and he begins working toward it the same way he works toward basketball excellence, systematically, patiently, with the specific discipline of someone who has already decided what they want. The dual life, basketball by day, building an operation with everything the robberies funded, continues through his teenage years and into adulthood. By the time he reaches Norfolk State University, where he averages 41 points per game and becomes the 1968 MVP, he is simultaneously one of the best college basketball players in America and already running a serious heroin distribution network in Harlem. His basketball reputation gives him something money alone can't buy. Visibility without suspicion. Visibility is part of the cover. Everyone in Harlem knows Pee Wee Kirkland. They know him from the courts. They celebrate him as one of their own, a local boy who can outplay anybody. That community love is a shield. It makes him harder to look at as a criminal, harder to build a case around, harder to isolate from the community that protects him. He is the Bank of Harlem, the basketball star, both at once. The college offers come in. UCLA wants him to play alongside Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who is himself already one of the most dominant players in the country. Kirkland turns it down. The Chicago Bulls draft him, the 1969 NBA draft. His name called, an invitation to the most prestigious professional basketball league in the world. He turns that down, too. People who didn't understand the math thought this was insane. People who understood the math understood exactly what Kirkland was doing. The average NBA salary in 1969 was approximately $20,000 a year, $20,000. Pee Wee Kirkland was already making significantly more than that per week. Some accounts suggest his weekly earnings at peak exceeded the entire annual salary the Bulls were offering him. He told Vlad TV years later, flat, unapologetic, completely clear, that his drug operation was bigger than Frank Lucas's. That the scenes in the 2007 American gangster film were sensationalized. That the real story of what was moving through Harlem in those years was larger and more organized than Hollywood ever portrayed. He claimed to be the first young millionaire in Harlem, not the richest man eventually, the first young millionaire, meaning the first man of his generation in that neighborhood to reach 7 figures before turning 30. The streets called him the Bank of Harlem, not because he kept money for other people, because his operation was the financial engine of a neighborhood's underground economy. Millions flowed annually through a heroin distribution network he had built from robberies at 13 into something federal investigators would eventually take seriously enough to pursue with the full weight of their resources. He was convicted on federal drug conspiracy charges. He served 10 years in federal prison. He came out and did something completely unexpected. He opened basketball camps. The School of Skills, a basketball and life skills program that eventually became co-sponsored by Nike, began in the 1990s on Saturdays in Harlem. The man who had turned down UCLA and the Chicago Bulls was now spending his weekends teaching Harlem's children the game he had once used as cover for an empire. The camps spread nationwide. He became a motivational speaker. He mentored hip-hop artists. Ludacris has publicly credited Kirkland with influencing his decision to leave street life behind. The man the NBA drafted, who said no because the streets paid more, spent his later years making sure that the next generation understood what that choice actually costs. The Bank of Harlem, still open, different currency. Number 2, Aaron Jones, a boy. Philadelphia, the errand kid who built the most feared empire in the city's history. Philadelphia, the 1970s. A boy is running errands, not for a corner dealer, not for a neighborhood crew with 5 members and 2 corners, for the original Philadelphia Black Mafia, the most feared black criminal organization in the city's history. Men who had terrorized Philadelphia through the 1960s and 70s, who had connections to the Nation of Islam and the Italian mob simultaneously, who controlled the city's underground economy through organized violence and operational sophistication that law enforcement spent years trying to understand and document. This boy carries messages, picks up packages, does whatever the men at the top need done, stays quiet, stays available, stays observant. He watches everything. He learns everything. His name is Aaron Jones. The street would eventually come to know him as AJ. He came up under Robert Nudie Mims, a founding member of the original Black Mafia, who recognized the specific quality in this young man that separated him from other kids running errands on these streets. Not just willingness, not just reliability, intelligence. Mims taught him, not formally, not in classrooms, but in the way the underground economy transmits knowledge, through proximity, through observation, through being present when decisions were made, and understanding not just what was decided, but why. Jones absorbed every lesson. He also had something the original Black Mafia had never fully developed. He had attended Temple University. He understood organizational structure at a level that street-level operators almost never reach. He understood that an organization's strength came from its chain of command, and its durability came from its ability to function when individual members were removed. That understanding, gained from books and from watching the original Black Mafia operate, would define everything he built. Because the original Black Mafia fell. Court convictions, internal wars, federal indictments. The men Jones had run errands for as a boy were dead, imprisoned, or scattered. The throne was empty. January 1985. Aaron Jones founded the Junior Black Mafia. He was not starting from scratch. He was starting from memory, from every lesson absorbed watching the original organization operate and fail. He took what had worked and discarded what had destroyed them. The JBM's motto said everything, get down or lay down. You either bought your product from Aaron Jones's organization at their price on their terms, or you dealt with the consequences. No exceptions. No grandfather clauses for dealers who had been operating independently for years. No negotiations. Get down or lay down. The growth was extraordinary. Within months, the JBM was running product through Southwest Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, and into neighboring states. Jones had identified and locked up supply connections the original Black Mafia had never established. He built a direct line to the Italian mob through a lieutenant named Benny Goff, who ran legitimate auto businesses in Manayunk, using those businesses as a bridge to Italian organized crime figures who brought cocaine supply that the JBM moved. The Italians had supply. The JBM had distribution. Two organizations that should have been natural enemies doing business as partners. At peak, the JBM was moving 200 to 300 kilograms of cocaine per month. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission, in published reports dedicated specifically to the JBM, estimated the organization's total criminal proceeds across its operational lifetime at $100 million. $100 million from one organization. In Philadelphia, they had 50 members, 300 associates, diamond-encrusted JBM rings worn openly by members as identifiers, a statement of belonging to something too powerful to hide. 33 legitimate businesses used as fronts. Jones dressed like a king. Money green everything, money green Fila sweatsuit, money green Adidas, money green Benz. He pulled up on corners the way a king pulls up, and everyone on those corners understood what his arrival meant. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission attributed 25 murders to JBM-related activity in a single 14-month stretch. A joint federal task force assembled to bring him down included the DEA, the ATF, the FBI, the IRS, Pennsylvania State Police, and local law enforcement. That level of coordinated federal attention does not get deployed against small operations. It gets deployed against organizations that have become institutional problems. The errand boy had built something that required 6 federal agencies to dismantle. He was eventually convicted. Federal drug conspiracy charges. Death row in Pennsylvania for a murder conviction he maintains to this day was built on fabricated testimony from unreliable witnesses. He still fights his case from death row. The original Black Mafia, the organization whose coffee he fetched as a boy, was never powerful enough to attract that level of attention. Aaron Jones built something that was. Number 3, Michael Harry O. Harris. Early 20s. South Central Los Angeles. $2 million a day. Death row records from a prison cell. South Central Los Angeles, the 1980s. Michael Harris grows up in the Low Bottoms, a neighborhood on West 46th Street in South Central that earned its name honestly. Single-parent household, mother working 2 jobs, father gone before Michael was 5 years old. He opens his first legitimate business before he fully commits to the streets. A music studio, the Jingle Factory, specializing in creating radio commercials for local Los Angeles businesses. He is already thinking like an entrepreneur before he is thinking like a drug dealer. The business mind is there first, but the streets of South Central in the early 1980s are offering something the jingle business cannot match. He builds connections with the Bounty Hunter Bloods, one of the most powerful street gangs in Watts, California. Those connections become the foundation of a distribution network. His supply chain elevates quickly to something most South Central operators never access. Through connections that federal prosecutors would later document in court, Harris establishes a supply relationship with Colombian national Mario Ernesto Villabona Alvarado, a reputed high-ranking member of the Cali cartel. The Cali cartel in the 1980s is the most sophisticated cocaine trafficking organization in the world. Their product is consistently pure. Their prices for operators who can demonstrate they can move volume are competitive in ways that other sources cannot match. Harris can move volume. Florida, Iowa, Illinois, New York, Texas, 5 states, from a man in his early 20s operating out of South Central Los Angeles. At peak, Michael Harry O'Harris's operation was generating an estimated $2 million a day in revenue. $2 million daily. Think about what that number means. At peak volume, Harris's operation was generating more revenue per day than most legitimate businesses in Los Angeles generated per month. He invested methodically. Real estate across Southern California, properties that gave his wealth physical form, that created legitimate explanations for his lifestyle. He invested in culture. He became the first African American to produce a Broadway play, running a theater company that, by multiple documented accounts, was the organization that first recognized and identified the talent of a young actor named Denzel Washington. Denzel Washington, the man who would win 2 Academy Awards, who would portray Malcolm X and Frank Lucas and Herman Boone and Reuben Hurricane Carter and dozens of other roles that defined American cinema. The first person to identify his talent as worth investing in was a South Central drug lord named Harry O. Harris, also befriended Tom Bradley, the longest-serving mayor in Los Angeles history, who spent years trying to convert major drug operators into legitimate businessmen. Harris and Bradley had what one account described as a plan for the black community, a vision that the proceeds of the underground economy could be redirected into legitimate infrastructure. It was not realized. In 1987, the walls closed in. Harris was arrested, charged with drug trafficking, kidnapping, and attempted murder. Prosecutors said he had suspected an employee of stealing from his operation and had the man taken to the desert. He was sentenced to 28 years. The godfather of South Central was in federal custody. And then, from inside the Metropolitan Detention Center in downtown Los Angeles, Michael Harris changed American music forever. He heard about a young man named Marion Knight, a former college football player, a bodyguard who had moved into the music business, who had artists, including Dr. Dre, freshly departed from NWA, and an idea for a record label. Knight came to visit Harris in the detention center, not as an inmate, as a businessman making a pitch. Harris listened. He understood what Knight was describing. He understood the music industry's potential the same way he had understood cocaine distribution's potential, as a market, as a system, as a business with inputs and outputs and margins that could be calculated and optimized. He set up Godfather Entertainment, named with complete deliberateness as a multimedia company that would serve as the parent company of the new label. He provided $1.5 million in financing from a prison cell through his attorney, David Kenner, as intermediary. That $1.5 million became the financial foundation of Death Row Records. The label that released The Chronic in 1992, the album that redefined West Coast hip-hop and launched Dr. Dre as a solo artist. That released Doggy Style in 1993, Snoop Dogg's debut album that sold over 21 million copies worldwide. That released All Eyes on Me in 1996, Tupac Shakur's landmark double album. Death Row Records sold 18 million albums total, shaped the entire cultural trajectory of hip-hop in the 1990s, was funded by a man in a detention center who was making phone calls to artists from his cell. Harris said, "I would talk to Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and the whole family, everybody that was signed to Death Row. From prison, calling artists whose music was playing everywhere." He was eventually granted clemency by President Donald Trump in January of 2021 after 33 years in federal custody. He walked out. He became the chief operating officer of the newly reformed Death Row Records. He founded activist organizations. He wept publicly on camera, thanking the president who freed him. The man who started with a jingle studio, who built a $2 million a day operation, who scouted Denzel Washington's talent, who co-founded the most important record label in hip-hop history from a detention center, is still here, still building. Number 4, Kevin Chiles. A teenager, Harlem, the biggest drug lord since Nicky Barnes, who built a magazine empire from prison. Harlem, 1986. Kevin Chiles is a teenager. He grew up between the Bronx and Harlem, a basketball-playing hustler who first started formulating his illegal business while attending Bronx Community College. The crack era that many historians date to 1984 had just begun, reshaping New York City's black neighborhoods into something simultaneously more dangerous and more lucrative than anything that had come before. Kevin Chiles stepped into it at exactly the right moment, or the wrong one, depending on how you measure. He starts hustling in 1986, the same year as Rich Porter, Alpo Martinez, and Ozzy Faison. The same crack era, the same Harlem streets, the same open gold rush that was turning teenage boys into millionaires almost overnight. But Kevin Chiles builds something fundamentally different from all of them. Not louder, not more visible, not more theatrical, more sophisticated, more structured, more deliberately insulated from the specific vulnerabilities that would eventually destroy almost everyone around him. He wasn't the most famous name on those Harlem blocks. He wasn't buying Porsche 944s with paper bags of cash or wearing the same designer outfit only once. He wasn't the one who inspired movies or the one rappers named songs after. He was the one who lasted longest. He attracted the attention of the New York Times, which described him as the biggest drug lord in Harlem since Nicky Barnes, without ever becoming the kind of public figure that made him an easy target. That distinction mattered enormously, because in Harlem in the crack era, visibility was a death sentence. Rich Porter became the brand, and the brand became what killed him. His name was too big. His face was too known. His lifestyle was too visible to survive in a world where visibility invited the kind of attention that ended empires. Kevin Chiles understood something different. He built his cocaine operation with the specific discipline of a man who had watched what happened to men who built their operations with too much noise. His network ran from Harlem along the New Jersey Turnpike, known in those years as Cocaine Alley, for the extraordinary volume of product moving through it in both directions, all the way down to Washington, D.C. The operation ran from 1987 to 1994, 7 years, in the most intensely policed era in New York City's history, during the years when annual murders peaked at 2,245, during the years when the federal government was deploying every tool available to dismantle the crack trade that was destroying black communities across America. Kevin Chiles kept his operation running for 7 years. The DEA built their case over more than 2 years. When they finally moved, the charges were money laundering, narcotics trafficking, and the federal Kingpin statute, an accusation reserved for the leaders of the most significant drug trafficking organizations in the country. He went to trial. The jury could not reach a verdict. Hung jury. No conviction. The government tried again. Second trial. Second jury. Second hung jury. 2 separate federal trials. 2 separate juries. Neither able to agree that the evidence was sufficient to convict the man the New York Times had called the biggest drug lord in Harlem since Nicky Barnes. That is extraordinary, not just in the sense that it demonstrates the quality of his legal defense, but in the sense that it demonstrates how carefully he had operated, how much insulation he had built between himself and the documentation that prosecutors need. He eventually accepted a PLEE deal. Not because the government had beaten him, they had not beaten him, twice, but because the sentences being handed down to men of his stature in that era were catastrophic. Life without parole, decades in federal custody, men around him receiving sentences that amounted to the rest of their natural lives for operations no larger than what he had built. The mathematics of a third trial, with the possibility of a conviction carrying a mandatory life sentence, made the plea deal a rational choice. He was sentenced to 10 years. In 1999, Kevin Chiles went to prison, and the same year he went in, from inside that prison, he launched Don Diva magazine with his wife Tiffany from prison. Don Diva was not a small publication. It was not a hobby project. It became the street Bible of an era, the publication that documented the crack epidemic's kingpins, their stories, their codes, their downfalls, and the communities they had shaped from a perspective that mainstream media had never provided and never wanted to provide. Mainstream media covered crack as a crime story, as a statistics story, as a cautionary tale about the consequences of bad choices. Don Diva covered it as a human story, as the story of communities that the legitimate economy had abandoned, as the story of intelligent men and women who had walked through the only door fully open to them, and of what they had built and lost and found on the other side. The magazine became one of the most influential street publications in American history, referenced by rappers, studied by academics, interested in the culture of the crack era, read by people who had lived through that era and never seen themselves represented in print with accuracy and complexity. Kevin Chiles built it from a prison cell with his wife, from nothing. He wrote a memoir, The Crack Era, The Rise, Fall, and Redemption of Kevin Chiles, published in 2019, documenting everything: the operations, the trials, the plea, the prison years, the magazine, the reinvention. The New York Times once called him the biggest drug lord in Harlem since Nicky Barnes. He became something Nicky Barnes never became: a publisher, an author, an entrepreneur who built a media company from inside federal prison and kept building it after he got out. The teenager from the Bronx who was drawn to Harlem street life in 1986, who built quietly while everyone around him built loudly, who beat 2 federal trials and then built an entire new industry from a prison cell. That is Kevin Chiles. Sometime around 2002, 3 men sit down for lunch at a restaurant in Baltimore. The first man is a former newspaper reporter. The second is a former police detective. The third is a former drug lord. The reporter covered the drug lord's arrest. The detective built the case that put the drug lord in prison. The drug lord did 18 years because of them. And now all three of them are eating lunch together because the reporter and the detective have just created a television show for HBO based on the drug lord's life, based on the detective's investigation, based on the reporter's articles, based on the corners, the stash houses, the wiretaps, and the bodies that all three of them knew by name. The show is called The Wire. Over lunch, the reporter looks at the drug lord, the man whose empire he chronicled, whose arrest he covered, whose prison sentence he watched play out, and asks him a question. Have you ever considered acting? The drug lord says yes. And that is how Melvin Williams, the man who ran Baltimore's streets for 3 decades, who sold what he claimed was $1 billion in product, who stopped a riot that the National Guard could not stop, ended up playing a Reformed church deacon in the television show based on his own life, sitting in scenes with actors playing characters based on his dealers, walking the same corners his empire built, wearing a suit and tie in the same neighborhoods where he once wore leather and carried a gun. The cop who arrested him vouched for the role. This is the most insane story in the history of television, and almost nobody knows it happened. Melvin Douglas Williams was born December 14, 1941, in Baltimore City Hospital. His father drove a cab. His mother was a nurse's aide. They raised him on Madison Avenue in West Baltimore. Normal family, normal house. Nothing about the Williams household suggested what was coming, but Melvin had something. Teachers noticed it early. The boy had a genius-level IQ, not smart for his age, genius, the kind of mind that processes information faster than the people around it can deliver. He attended Garnet Elementary School, then Frederick Douglass High School, then transferred to City College, one of Baltimore's best public schools. He dropped out in the 11th grade, not because he couldn't do the work, because he'd already found a classroom that paid better. Pennsylvania Avenue. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Pennsylvania Avenue was the beating heart of Black Baltimore. Jazz clubs, pool halls, juke joints, gambling dens behind every other door. The Royal Theater hosted James Brown, Ray Charles, Billie Holiday. The Strip was alive. And in the back rooms, the real education happened. By age 12, Melvin Williams was sitting in those gambling dens, not watching, playing, beating grown men, beating gang members, beating crime bosses, winning thousands of dollars against men 3 times his age. A child prodigy, not of music, not of mathematics, of the hustle. By age 15, according to the documentary Life in the Game, Melvin Williams was already a millionaire. 15 years old, genius IQ, $1 million, and an entire avenue that knew his name. He wasn't Little Melvin because of his size. He was Little Melvin because of his age. Every prodigy needs a teacher, and Melvin found the most dangerous one in Baltimore, Julius Salisbury, known as the Lord. Salisbury was a Jewish gangster who ran gambling operations across Baltimore, including numbers, bookmaking, and high-stakes card games. He was soft-spoken, aristocratic, sharp-featured, the kind of man who dressed like a banker and moved like a predator. Salisbury took one look at the kid from Madison Avenue and saw what everybody else saw, a mind that could run an empire. He took Melvin under his wing, taught him the fundamentals, not just gambling anymore, supply lines, organization, how to compartmentalize, keep yourself away from the product while controlling in every gram that moves through your territory. And most importantly, Salisbury connected Melvin to New York. That connection changed everything, because New York had the supply, Baltimore had the demand, and Melvin Williams was about to become the bridge. By the mid-1960s, Williams had transitioned from gambling prodigy to full-scale trafficking. Product flowed down from New York. Money flowed back up. And Pennsylvania Avenue, the strip where Melvin had been hustling since he was 12, became the most profitable corridor in Baltimore. Not a single block. An avenue, miles of it, all flowing through one man. David Simon, who would later create The Wire, described Williams in his own words: West Baltimore's man-child, quick-witted and calculating, a prodigy from Pennsylvania Avenue's pool halls and juke joints, where the hustler's game was played night after night. By 1967, the authorities could not ignore it anymore. Williams was arrested for possession, for selling, and for carrying a firearm. A criminal court judge named Anselm Sodaro looked at the 26-year-old standing in his courtroom and told him, the judge called him a big fish in the nefarious traffic of slow death. He sentenced Williams to 12 years. Williams told the Afro newspaper he was framed by a corrupt narcotics detective. He served time. He came back. And he came back bigger. April 4th, 1968, Memphis, Tennessee. An assassin's bullet killed the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. 2 days later, Baltimore explodes. Stores on fire, windows smashed, looting from one end of the city to the other. The governor calls in the National Guard, thousands of troops, 500 state police. It is not enough. The governor calls the president. President Lyndon Johnson sends 5,000 paratroopers from Fort Bragg, combat engineers, artillerymen, bayonets fixed, chemical dispersers strapped to their backs, 6 people dead, 700 injured, 4,500 arrested, over 1,000 fires, 1,000 businesses looted or burned. The damage will be estimated at $10 million. And in the middle of it all, the mayor of Baltimore, Tommy D'Alessandro III, does something that nobody expected. He calls a drug lord. He calls little Melvin Williams. Because the National Guard can clear a street, but they cannot calm a neighborhood. The police can arrest rioters, but they cannot stop the rage. The only man who could walk down Pennsylvania Avenue and make people listen was not a politician. He was not a preacher. He was not a general. It was the man who ran the avenue. Williams made the calls. He brought the hustlers together from East Baltimore, South Baltimore, and West Baltimore. He made appeals, not speeches. Appeals, man to man, corner to corner. The next day, the riots stopped on Pennsylvania Avenue. A photograph ran on the front page of the Baltimore News American. In the picture, little Melvin Williams, wearing a leather jacket, stood next to Major General George Gelston, the commander of the Maryland National Guard. A drug lord and a general, side by side, on the front page. The man the judge had called a big fish in the nefarious traffic of slow death had just done what the National Guard, the state police, and 5,000 paratroopers could not do. And then he went right back to business. Through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, little Melvin Williams built one of the most sophisticated operations on the East Coast. His organization ran like a corporation, compartmentalized, layered, street-level runners who never touched the supply, lieutenants who managed territory, enforcers who handled problems. And at the top, Melvin, always at a distance, always insulated, always wearing dark clothing, black suits, black shirts, which earned him one of his other nicknames, Black. He developed a communication system using payphones and the new technology of portable pagers, originally designed for doctors. His people used coded pager messages to coordinate deliveries and avoid police wiretaps. It was years ahead of what other operations were doing. His operation controlled Pennsylvania Avenue and stretched across West Baltimore. Federal prosecutors would later estimate that his network grossed $1 million a day. $1 million per day. In the FX documentary Tapping the Wire, Williams himself said he made at least a couple $100 million through trafficking. In 2012, he went further. He claimed he had sold more than $1 billion in product in his lifetime. And according to David Simon's research for the Baltimore Sun, Williams' organization was responsible for 25% of all murders in Baltimore during its peak. A quarter of the city's murders. One operation, one man at the top. He lived accordingly. Luxury cars, diamonds, furs, a Park Avenue fortress. The kind of lifestyle that makes you untouchable until the day it doesn't. In the early 1980s, a Baltimore Police Department detective named Edward Burns was assigned to investigate Melvin Williams. Burns was patient, methodical, relentless. He did not kick in doors. He did not chase runners. He did something far more dangerous to a man like Melvin Williams. He listened. Burns ran a 2-year wiretap investigation, painstakingly combing through pager records, turning underlings into informants, mapping the legitimate business fronts that Williams used to distance himself from the product, and following the money through tax records, property filings, and bank transactions. 2 years, quietly, while Williams thought he was untouchable. On December 6, 1984, a consortium of city, state, and federal agents descended on Williams's Park Avenue fortress. They seized a Bugatti valued at $54,000. They seized $250,000 worth of diamonds, furs, and jewelry. They seized nearly $300,000 in cash. They also seized guns. On February 7, 1985, Melvin Williams was convicted and sentenced to 34 years in federal prison. He was sent to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. The IRS came next, assessing $425,000 in back taxes. They seized his home. The king of Pennsylvania Avenue was gone. And the detective who took him down, Ed Burns, would eventually quit the police force, become a teacher in Baltimore public schools, and then do something that nobody could have predicted. He became a television writer, but that part comes later. While Melvin Williams sat in Lewisburg, a young reporter at the Baltimore Sun was building his own career on the same streets Williams had ruled. His name was David Simon. In 1987, Simon published a 5-part investigative series called Easy Money: Anatomy of a Drug Empire. It was the most detailed treatment of Williams's criminal career ever written. Simon had spent months on it, interviewing sources, reviewing court records, and walking the corners that Williams had controlled. The series laid bare how Williams built his operation: the supply lines, the organization, the money, the violence, and the human cost, the addicts, the families, the neighborhoods hollowed out block by block. Simon was fascinated by Williams, not as a criminal, as a system. Williams was not just a man dealing product. He was a machine, and the machine told a story about what was happening to American cities. Simon filed the series away, moved on to other stories, but he never forgot Melvin Williams, never forgot Pennsylvania Avenue, never forgot what the product did to Baltimore. 15 years later, he would turn all of it into a television show. In 2002, HBO premiered a new drama called The Wire, created by David Simon, co-written by Ed Burns, the reporter who covered Williams, the detective who arrested Williams. Together, they made television. The show was set in Baltimore on the West Side, on corners that Melvin Williams had controlled. The wiretap investigation in Season 1 was based directly on Burns's investigation of Williams. The stash houses, the pagers, the coded communication system, the layered organization designed to insulate the boss from the street. The character of Avon Barksdale, the charismatic, old-school kingpin who ran West Baltimore from the towers, was inspired by Melvin Williams. Not a direct copy, but the DNA was there. The loyalty, the business mind, the code, the inability to leave the game even when the game was killing everything around him. The Wire would run for 5 seasons, 60 episodes. It would be called the greatest television drama ever made by critics, academics, journalists, and audiences around the world. And it existed because a reporter wrote about a drug lord, a detective arrested that drug lord, and both of them turned that experience into art. But the story wasn't done yet, because the drug lord was about to walk back into the picture. David Simon told the story himself after Williams died. Sometime after Williams's release, Simon arranged a lunch. 3 men at a restaurant in Baltimore. Simon, Burns, and Williams. The reporter, the detective, the drug lord. It was 18 years after Burns had put Williams in prison. They sat across the same table, ordering drinks. Burns ordered an iced tea. Simon had a glass of the house red. Williams showed up late with a 4th guest. His driver that day was a man whom Simon immediately recognized as a former informant from Burns's narcotics cases. Burns did not flinch. He shook the man's hand and said, "Nice to meet you," playing it clean. The informant looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. They ate, they talked, about the city, about what had changed, about what had not. Leaving the restaurant, Williams handed Simon a business card with his phone number scrawled on it. Burns looked at the digits and laughed. Burns said, "What I would not have done for that 20 years ago." Then Burns told Williams something that carried the weight of everything between them. Burns said, "Stay free." Williams replied, "I intend to do just that." A week later, Simon called Williams back with an offer. It would be too provocative, Simon figured, to cast the city's most notorious trafficker as a gangster on the wire. But there was another role, a church deacon, a reformed man, a man who counsels troubled people in West Baltimore, helping them find a way out. Simon told Williams that a lunch with Melvin Williams suggests that he is already quite a performer. Williams took the role. Starting in Season 3, episode All Due Respect, Melvin Williams appeared on The Wire as the deacon, a wise, battle-scarred church figure on the West Side, a man with contacts everywhere, in the streets, in City Hall, in the academic world, a man who helps an ex-convict named Cuddy open a boxing gym, who connects him with politicians who can cut through the red tape, who quietly steers broken men away from the game without ever raising his voice. The deacon was the man Melvin Williams wished he had been all along, and here is what nobody watching at home understood. The actor playing the deacon had once run the very corners they were filming on. The stash houses in the show were inspired by his stash houses. The pager codes the characters used were based on his communication system. The wiretap that drives Season 1 was based on the investigation that put him in prison. And the CO writer of the show, E.D. Burns, was the detective who had listened to his phone calls for 2 years. Williams sat in scenes with actors playing characters inspired by his own operation. He gave fictional advice about leaving the game, advice he had spent decades learning the hard way. He wore a suit and tie in neighborhoods where he had once worn leather and carried a weapon. The cop who arrested him had vouched for his casting. The reporter who covered his arrest had offered him the role. There has never been anything like it in the history of television. A real drug lord playing a reformed version of himself in a show based on his own arrest, created by the men who covered and executed that arrest. The Wire ran through Season 5. Williams appeared in Seasons 3, 4, and 5. He was not playing a character. He was playing a ghost. The man he might have been if he had made different choices at 12 years old in those gambling dens on Pennsylvania Avenue. But Melvin Williams's story did not end with redemption. In March 1999, while on parole, Williams was convicted of a new offense. He was sentenced to 22 years in December 2000. The streets pulled at him even after everything. But his attorney, Michael Marr, successfully argued that the sentence exceeded mandatory guidelines. The conviction was overturned. Williams walked free in 2003, and this time something stuck. He told U.S. District Judge Marvin Garbus during a court appearance that sometime in his 50s, he became aware that there was a God in charge and not a Melvin. He became an ordained minister. He ran Saturday training sessions for young people at his building on North Avenue. He brought in lawyers to teach kids about the criminal justice system. He traveled to Chester, Pennsylvania, and Atlanta, Georgia, helping gang members find their way out. A former gang member named Ted Sutton said that Melvin took him under his wing and helped him to see things differently. He said Melvin spoke to young men and taught them self-respect and the law, and that they would listen to him. They listened because he was not a politician telling them what to do. He was not a preacher who had never seen the streets. He was Melvin Williams, the man who ran Pennsylvania Avenue, the man who stopped the 1968 riots, the man who sold $1 billion in product and did the time for it. When Melvin Williams told you the game was not worth it, you listened, because he had played it at the highest level and lost everything. David Simon, after Williams died, wrote that Melvin did a lot of damage, and he would be the first to admit it. He was a fascinating man in terms of Baltimore and what the product war was going to do to this country. On December 3rd, 2015, 11 days before his 74th birthday, Melvin Douglas Williams died at the University of Maryland Medical Center. Cancer. He was survived by his wife, Mary, and 2 daughters. Reverend Frank Reed III, pastor of Bethel AME Church, the church Williams had attended in his final years, said it simply that Melvin Williams is a Baltimore 20th century legend. Former Mayor Kurt Schmoke said that he became the symbol of crime problems in the city, whether he wanted to or not. In his later years, he tried to improve himself and help the community. Former Baltimore Police Commissioner Leonard Hamm knew him well. He said he knew of his notoriety and his antics on Pennsylvania Avenue. Pennsylvania Avenue, that is where it all started. Where a 12-year-old genius sat down at a card table and beat men who should have known better. Where a 15-year-old became a millionaire. Where a 26-year-old built an empire. Where a drug lord stopped a riot that 5,000 soldiers could not stop. Where a detective listened through a wiretap for 2 years. Where a reporter wrote 5 articles that would change television forever. Pennsylvania Avenue is where The Wire was born, not in a Hollywood writer's room, not on an HBO lot, but on a strip in West Baltimore where a kid with a genius IQ chose the wrong classroom. The corners are still there, the towers are gone, the Royal Theater is gone, the pool halls are gone, but The Wire is still streaming. 60 episodes, millions of viewers, called the greatest television drama ever made. And every frame of it traces back to one man. A man who ran those streets, who got arrested by the cop who wrote the show, who got profiled by the reporter who created the show, who got invited to play a reformed version of himself in the show, and who died knowing that his life, all of it, the genius and the damage, the riots and the prison, the diamonds and the pager codes, had become the most important story ever told about what America did to its cities. Melvin Williams did not just inspire The Wire, he was The Wire. And The Wire was Pennsylvania Avenue. And Pennsylvania Avenue was a 12-year-old boy who was too smart for the world he was born into. 50 Cent has built TV empires out of street legends. BMF, Power, Raising Canaan. But there's one story he hasn't told yet, and it might be the most insane one of all. A TV series called Obsession, based on the life of a teenager from the South Bronx who built a $15 million empire before he was old enough to drink. A kid who was sleeping on park benches, brushing his teeth at fire hydrants, and within 12 months was pulling up in a white Mercedes, employing men twice his age and running the most aggressive operation the Bronx had ever seen. Before he turned 18, he had 50 employees on weekly salary. He had branded product with a Crown logo. He had a corporate front called Tuxedo Enterprises. He offered his workers cash bonuses, gifts, and Disney World vacations. He was operating his business like a Fortune 500 company, while his classmates were worrying about what to wear to school. By 20, the press was calling him the Puerto Rican James Bond because of the spy gadgets he installed in his fleet of luxury cars. By 21, he was a multi-millionaire linked to a dozen homicides. His name was George Rivera. The streets called him Boy George, and the story of how a homeless Puerto Rican teenager became the most feared young kingpin New York City had ever seen is the reason 50 Cent wants to put it on television. George Rivera was born in the South Bronx. His father left when he was 6 months old. His mother beat him with extension cords. He ran away from home at 10. By 12, he had a PINS order from the court. He was bouncing between group homes, relatives, and the streets. He ended up at a group home in New Rochelle, where other kids remembered him as quiet, charismatic, and always meticulously dressed, even when he had nothing. That detail matters. Even when George Rivera was sleeping on park benches, he made sure his clothes were clean. He brushed his teeth at fire hydrants. He pressed his shirts. He understood something most people never figure out. Power grows in proportion to what you make other people see. By the summer of 1985, George was 17 years old and living on the streets of the South Bronx at Washington Avenue and 166th Street. It was one of the most dangerous intersections in New York City. Rusted stoves jutted out of broken windows, scrap yards and garbage rot on every block. On the corner, 2 dealers, watchful, quiet, moving product. George watched them. He studied how they worked. He studied who they sold to. He studied the money, and he decided he wanted it, all of it. He did not start by selling. He started by managing. A local crew, the Torres brothers, let him handle their money, count it, pack it, do payroll, supply their dealers. He was 17 years old, doing the books for a street operation like an accountant. But George was not an accountant. He was learning the business from the inside, the same way a future chief executive officer learns by working in the mailroom. Within months, he went from counting someone else's money to building his own operation. And that is when the South Bronx found out what Boy George was really capable of. This is what made Boy George different from every other teenager selling on a corner in the 1980s in New York. While the rest of the city was chasing crack, every dealer, every crew, every corner, Boy George flipped the script. He sold something else entirely. While America was obsessed with the crack epidemic, Boy George was building an empire on the product nobody else was focused on. He saw a gap in the market that grown men missed, and he filled it. He branded it. He stamped every package with the name Obsession and a red crown logo. Later, he added a second brand, Sledgehammer. It was brand recognition for street product from a teenager who never finished high school. He set up a corporate front called Tuxedo Enterprises. He hired workers in their 30s and 40s, men who had been in the game for decades, and put them on a weekly salary, not commission salary like employees. He offered cash bonuses for performance. He sent his top earners on vacations to Disney World. He bought groceries for the families of his girlfriends, delivered daily by his dealers. For anyone who thought a teenager could not enforce discipline on grown men, Boy George had an answer. His motto was, "If I can trust you, I can kill you." He said it to every new hire, and he meant it. By the summer of 1987, his organization was moving $100,000 worth of product per week. Within a year, that number hit $250,000 per week. $9 million a year, then $15 million at his 2-year peak. He had 50 employees, multiple distribution spots across the South Bronx and Manhattan, stash houses, cutting mills, and a supply chain that ran like clockwork, all built by a kid who had been sleeping on park benches 2 years earlier. Established figures in New York's underworld took notice. You did not operate at this level in the late 1980s without the older generation knowing your name. Boy George was not just some corner kid. He was running an organization that rivaled crews led by men with decades of experience. The difference was, he was doing it at 19. The money came fast, and Boy George spent it like he was afraid it would disappear. He bought a mansion in Puerto Rico for $145,000 in cash. He had obsession, and the initials BG tiled into the bottom of the swimming pool, electronic security gates, a private basketball court, an apartment at Normandy Court on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the world. Inside, garbage bags full of cash, commercial real estate, a fleet of luxury cars that would make a rapper jealous. But the cars were not just expensive, they were weaponized. A customized Mercedes with $50,000 in upgrades, a license plate that slid out of view at the push of a button. Radar detectors, a strobe light mounted on the rear that blinded anyone tailing him, a device that sprayed oil from the tailpipe onto the road behind him, a switch that dropped nails from the bumper, and then there was the Porsche, customized for $140,000. Ostrich skin interior, multiple cell phones, color TV and VCR, a 630-watt stereo system, custom rugs, ebony finish, concealed compartments for cash and product. The press started calling him the Puerto Rican James Bond. The press called me the Puerto Rican James Bond because of the gadgets in my car, Boy George later said. The law would still be chasing me if I had made it to one of my cars the night of my arrest. He sent a girlfriend to San Francisco once just to buy a pair of Nikes that were not available yet in New York. Women across the South Bronx tattooed property of Boy George on their bodies. Not because he forced them, because they wanted to. He was 20 years old, a multi-millionaire, the most powerful young figure the Bronx had ever produced. And then he threw a party that would destroy everything. December 24th, 1988. The yacht Rivera was docked at World Yacht's 23rd Street Pier. Boy George arrived at 7 p.m. Everyone was clapping. 150 people boarded the ship. Teenagers in black tie, tuxedos, and gowns on a chartered yacht cruising New York Harbor on Christmas Eve. The tables were organized by spot location, each crew from each distribution point seated together, like departments at a corporate dinner. Distribution was how the room was arranged. There was a steak dinner, an open bar, and Big Daddy Kane performing live. Then came the gifts. Boy George handed his right-hand man $50,000 in cash and a Rolex watch. He gave another lieutenant a customized BMW. He distributed solid gold belt buckles with each recipient's name inscribed in diamonds to his top managers. Rolex and gold were signs of rank. Fights broke out between rival dealers at the party. At one point, a man was thrown overboard into the harbor. The captain's report described the 2-hour cruise as quite memorable. It was the most lavish party the New York drug world had seen since Nicky Barnes held court in Harlem. But this one was thrown by a 20-year-old kid from a park bench. But here is what Boy George did not know. Everything that happened on that yacht was being watched. The feds had been building a case, and the Christmas Eve party with the tuxedos, the gifts, the Rolexes, and the BMWs became the evidence that proved the scale of his operation. Photos from the party were later introduced at trial. The seating chart that organized crews by distribution spot was essentially a map of his entire empire, laid out on table cards. Boy George threw himself a party so extravagant it became the prosecution's best evidence. The violence was real. Boy George wasn't just charismatic, he was terrifying, and the bodies proved it. Federal authorities linked him to a dozen homicides. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated, strategic, the kind of killings that send messages. A man named Todd Crawford was murdered in the parking lot of the King Lobster restaurant on Boy George's orders. The trigger man was an enforcer. Boy George kept close, named Kong. Then came Yvette Padilla. Yvette had been accused of stealing a gold and diamond belt buckle inscribed with the word obsession from one of Boy George's supervisors. A belt buckle, that's all it took. Boy George arranged for Kong to meet Yvette at Ferry Point Park. Kong shot her. Then, according to members of the organization, he dumped her body off the Triborough Bridge for stealing a belt buckle. Kong's payment for the two murders? A few vials of product, a $5,000 cash bonus, and an invitation to the Christmas Eve yacht party. That's what a human life was worth in Boy George's operation. $5,000 and a seat on a boat. This is why established figures in New York knew his name. This is why men twice his age worked for him and didn't complain. This is why a teenager could command an empire that rivaled organizations run by men who had been in the game for decades. Because Boy George would kill you over a belt buckle. And everyone in the South Bronx knew it. The operation kept scaling. After a burglary scare at his Bronx apartment, Boy George moved his entire cutting mill, the operation where bulk product was processed, diluted, and packaged, into the Manhattan Marriott Marquis, a Times Square luxury hotel, where tourists stay, where businessmen hold conferences. On one of the upper floors, Boy George's workers were cutting and packaging product for distribution across the South Bronx and Manhattan. He also kept a stash house at Normandy Court, the Upper East Side apartment complex. Garbage bags full of cash, multiple luxury cars in parking garages across the city, properties in Puerto Rico. The federal government had been tracking him since 1987, when a confidential informant named Joey Novato introduced an undercover detective to Boy George. The detective bought product directly from him. Boy George bragged that his organization moved $250,000 worth per week. He was 19 years old and bragging to a cop about how much money he made. In June 1990, the 14-count indictment dropped. Conspiracy, running a criminal enterprise, tax evasion. The evidence was overwhelming. The yacht party photos. The wiretaps from the Puerto Rico mansion were damning. The feds had listened to his crew discuss the renovations, the swimming pool, and the obsession inscription on the bottom, the undercover buy, the testimony from workers who had been inside the operation. Boy George had one chance. If he could get to one of his James Bond cars, he might have escaped. He did not make it. George Rivera, known as Boy George, was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole for a man who was barely old enough to buy alcohol. He was one of the youngest people in American history to be charged and convicted under the federal Kingpin statute, a law designed for the biggest, most powerful drug lords in the country. He has been in prison since 1991, over 30 years. He went in as a kid. He is now in his late 50s. The South Bronx moved on. The blocks he ran are gentrified now. The park benches where he used to sleep are surrounded by coffee shops and condominium buildings. Nobody standing on Washington and 166th Street today would believe what happened there 35 years ago. His story was immortalized in Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc's book, Random Family, a 10-year reporting project that became one of the most acclaimed nonfiction books of the 2000s. LeBlanc started her research after attending Boy George's trial, and now 50 Cent is producing a television series based on his life called Obsession. It is named after the brand of product Boy George, stamped with a red crown and sold across the South Bronx. 50 Cent, a man who grew up on the same streets, who survived being shot 9 times, who built his own empire, looked at Boy George's story and said, "This is the one I need to tell." That tells you everything. Here is the math of Boy George's life. From park benches to $15 million in 2 years. From fire hydrants to a Puerto Rican mansion with Obsession tiled into the pool. From a group home in New Rochelle to a $140,000 Porsche with an ostrich skin interior. From nothing, literally nothing, to the most powerful young figure the Bronx had ever produced. And then life without parole at age 22. Every dollar, every car, every Rolex, every gold belt buckle with diamonds, every James Bond gadget, every garbage bag full of cash at Normandy Court, every steak dinner on a yacht on Christmas Eve. All of it traded for a cell. The Christmas Eve party was the peak. 150 people in black tie, Big Daddy Kane on stage, Rolex watches and BMWs handed out like party favors, a man thrown overboard into the harbor. And in that room, in those photos the feds would later introduce as evidence, was a 20-year-old kid from a park bench who had built everything from nothing in 24 months. He had the whole South Bronx in his hand. And the photos from his own party put him in prison for the rest of his life. Boy George once said that power grows in proportion to what you make other people see. He was right. The jury saw everything.